We should enforce security practices in Kubernetes clusters. Like, for example, a namespace should have some specific labels, or a container should never run as the root user. We can allow for deploying containers coming only from certain container registries, and each pod should have a specific resource quota, limits, and requests. Those different policies could be created with OPA, Open Policy Agent Gatekeeper, which is an open source project that is supported by the CNCF. In this demonstration, I'll show you how to use OPA Gatekeeper in Kubernetes to define policies. The source files and the commands that I'll be using during this demo are available on this GitHub repository. And to start the demo, I have already provisioned a Kubernetes cluster on Azure using the AKS service, but you can also do the same demo on any other Kubernetes cluster, whether that is a managed cluster or Minikube. In my VS Code, I have cloned the GitHub repository, so here I have the different files and the commands. And the first thing I'm going to do here is to deploy OPA Gatekeeper into the Kubernetes cluster. For that here, I'll be using the kubectl apply command, and I'll go to deploy this file that I'll show to you in a few seconds. So here, I'm already connected to my Kubernetes cluster, so I go to clear, and then I run the command to deploy the YAML manifest. That one will go to deploy the different resources needed to run OPA in my Kubernetes cluster. So you see here a bunch of resources have been created. Let's take a look at the content of that file. So here it's available on the official GitHub repository for OPA, where here we find the different resources that will be created from the namespace, the CRD definitions, and the different resources needed there. So with that, we have now OPA Gatekeeper deployed into our Kubernetes cluster. So let's check for the different pods that were created with that deployment. Let's go to clear this, and let's go to kube control, get ns, get the different namespaces, and we'll see here that we'll create a new namespace, call it gatekeeper system. So I'll take that namespace, I'll copy it, and then I run the command kube control get pods. I'll get the pods from the namespace gatekeeper system, and here we see 4 pods were created for that. So it will deploy, actually the daemon said that will deploy a pod into each machine. In my cluster I have 3 VMs. For that I have here 3 controllers, managers that will be deployed into there. So here we used the native Kubernetes manifest files in order to deploy OPA, but there is a work in progress for creating a Helm chart that supports the Helm v3 in order to deploy Gatekeeper. So keep a look on their GitHub repository that will be released soon. Let's now go to define and deploy a policy using OPA. For that here, I'll be using YAML manifest files. The constraint template is one of the CRD objects that were deployed by the OPA. This will define the parameters used inside the policy. So here we have an array of string, and then we have the policy itself. The definition of the policy here is created using Rego, which is the policy language used with APA. A policy will be always associated to a package, so here we have the name for that package. This policy will define a violation that will compare provided and required. Provided is actually the real labels used with a namespace. And then we have the required. Those will define the labels that should be used within the namespace. We'll define that into the missing property. So here we'll see the difference between required and provided. If the difference is more than 0, if we have any difference there, then we'll consider that this is a violation. For that, we'll be showing a message, and in this message we'll say, hey, you must provide those different labels for your namespace, and we'll add details to that message violation to say here you are missing some labels into your namespace. Now, how can we provide those required labels? So here where we have the second part of this policy, which defines here the Kubernetes required labels, which is a custom kind that were created by the policy itself into here, where here we have the different names for the kind Kubernetes required labels. So this will link both parts of this policy. That will define the properties for labels, and we have labels is defined also into this constraint here, where here we have a parameter section, we have the labels, and the label here should have the parameter, call it gatekeeper. And note how we are using that inside the namespace, inside any object that have the kind namespace in Kubernetes. And note also how we are excluding some namespaces from these checks. So here we have the namespaces for the kube system, for example, and so on. Let's now go to deploy the template and the constraints. For that, I'll use the command line for kube control, apply -f, then the name for the template itself. So first, and after the template, I'll go to deploy the constraints now. So kube control, apply -f, then the name of the constraints file. And now both are created. Now I'll go to try if this works as I expect. So here I have defined two namespaces. Let's start by the first namespace, which here is a namespace that have just a name and doesn't have labels. And remember, in our policy, we are denying deploying those namespaces without the label. So I'll try to deploy this first namespace. I've called it bad namespace because this shouldn't work. Kube control, apply -f, then my first namespace that doesn't have any label. And here, note how I get error from server denied by must have GC for gatekeeper. You must provide labels, gatekeeper, and here error when creating the namespace. Admission webhook, that's the admission controller used by OPA, and that one have denied me for creating the namespace because doesn't have the right labels. Great. Now let's try with another namespace that have the required labels, which is the gatekeeper. So I'll go now to deploy not the bad namespace, but now I'll go to deploy the good namespace that have the required label. And here it tells me my namespace was successfully created because it respects the policy that I have defined with OPA using Gatekeeper. And this was how to create policies in Kubernetes using the Open Policy Agent. If you are looking for more content about Kubernetes, DevOps, and Azure, I would invite you to check out my YouTube channel where here I post regularly lots of videos about those topics.